Hey internets, so this video is going to be a tier list of some pretty bad economic myths out there, because there's a lot of opinions on economics out there that continue to have no grounds in rationality or reality in any way, shape, or form, and yet people still believe them and people still spread them around. Even politicians and economists themselves tend to spread some of these myths around. And also, I figured I would add this very highly relevant meme for this video to the merch store. The economist with a little Marxist tumor growing on his head. So sad. Unfortunately, it is inoperable. Personally, I think it looks best in gray, but you are free to disagree with me on that and buy whichever color you want. And all the profits from this really do help me out in continuing to make content. So a link to this will be in the description below, or you can just follow it from the link on the screen. Now, of course, before I get started, I have to kind of explain how this tier list is going to work, because all of these takes are bad, so being rated highly doesn't necessarily mean that it's a better economic take. Rather, this tier list is rating them based on how well-versed in economics and rationality you have to be to realize why these are wrong. And that's why there's only 4 categories here. So things at the bottom, these are things that even a child can understand why it doesn't actually make any sense. As in, you could explain the rationality behind this to, say, an 8-year-old, and they'd probably get it. And so then, of course, in the pleb zone are myths that aren't uncommon to see with people who have just a high school diploma and nothing more. And then in the midwit zone, you have people who are college educated but not economists, who may commonly believe some of these myths. And at the top, on the flip side, it's going to be things that even an economist may fall for some of these myths. Or economicists, as I sometimes like to call them. This is actually a video topic that more than one person has requested. Yes, I actually do read my Discord. And also I wanted to make this video because there's a few economic takes in here that just aren't quite worth their own video. They're common but simple enough that you can explain why it doesn't make sense in less than a minute or two. But anyways, let's get started with a common but very, very dumb one, which is, why doesn't the government just print infinite monies? And that one goes straight down to even a child can understand this. Yeah, I'm sorry, but anybody who still does not understand that money simply is a trade medium that is used to represent wealth, but is not actually the resource it represents itself, and therefore obviously the government printing infinite money wouldn't actually create infinite wealth. It would just decrease the value of money. Honestly, this is kind of one of those really basic takes where anybody who still thinks this way past the age of 18, not gonna make it. Sorry, just flat out not going to make it. The unfortunate fact that there are millions of people who have the right to vote but do not understand this is honestly one of the biggest flaws of democracy. Next up is one that's a little bit harder to understand: apathy. It's the belief that economics doesn't matter at all. You shouldn't study economics, it's too vague of a field, it's too subjective, a lot of the models don't work, and to some degree I can kind of understand this one. The problem with it though is that one of the big things that economics studies is the study of human action and how it works. And so when you really start to understand economics, you also start to understand why people do certain things and make certain decisions even better than many psychiatrists understand it. And that in turn allows you to make more rational decisions with your own money. And so that one goes into the pleb zone. It makes sense to think this way, but only as long as you don't know anything about economics at all. A smarter elementary school child can get this one as well, but again, the even a child can understand this is based around the average kid. So let's move on to strict empiricism. And what I mean by this is the empiricist fallacy. I cannot measure X, therefore X does not exist. Realizing just how many college-educated people think this way was a huge red pill for me on realizing just how many people on this planet aren't very good at logic. I mean, I honestly even see this in a few economicists, but for the most part, it's in the midwit zone. Most economists understand at the very least that economics needs at least a little bit of rationalism for it to begin to make any sense at all. No matter how reliant on models they are, in order to believe this and be an economist, you need to have your head pretty firmly planted in the sand. And anyway, the problem with it is actually one of the biggest problem with economic models, which is that incentives and thymology are the most important things when it comes to economics, but a lot of economic models aren't able to measure that because it's very hard to measure incentives. And so what a lot of midwits do is they just like, well, we can't measure this, so we're just going to pretend it doesn't exist. And so that's where you get really stupid takes, like people trying to think that certain forms of taxation don't do anything to incentives because of insert empirical study right here that didn't account for those incentives and didn't account for tax incidence. Yeah, TLDR, just because it can't be counted doesn't mean it doesn't count. Just because you can't read people's minds and empirically measure incentives, that doesn't mean you get to pretend that it's zero. Bad midwit, no more Rick and Morty for you. Anyway, next up is tax the rich. or the belief that all of our economic woes can be solved by simply taxing the rich and spreading the wealth around. I kind of explained this one in an entire video already. The TLDR of it is that you can't actually tax the rich. It's not actually possible to just tax the rich. And the thing is, understanding why it doesn't work requires a pretty in-depth understanding of tax incidence and how that affects supply and demand, and when businesses will eat the costs and when they will pass it to the consumer, and it also ultimately requires you understanding that it will eventually get passed to the consumer. And so thus taxes eventually kind of just even out no matter who is taxed. And so that one goes firmly in the midwit zone. A lot of people still believe this, regardless of education level. It's really only when you really start to study economics pretty hard do you realize why taxing the rich doesn't work. I see a lot of lefties with their college degrees who all seem to think that they are total geniuses for thinking that we can just tax the rich and it will just magically resolve scarcity. Nope, sorry, moving on. Specifically to colonialism. So this is the belief that capitalism is colonialism, and it's a common misconception by looking at the fact that countries which had a more free market and were more capitalistic in general were in the past more likely to engage in colonialist activities. Now, this one is actually believed by many midwits and many economicists, so you will actually find some very well-educated people who still believe this. However, I'm going to throw it in the pleb zone, and the reason I throw it in the pleb zone is because the refutation to it is actually very simple. It is a straightforward false cause fallacy. The reality is it was simply richer countries that were able to engage and sustain colonialism, and those richer countries used a system that was more or less a mixture of capitalism, nationalism, and mercantilism, which isn't really capitalism. It's actually when the mercantilist and nationalist aspects of those countries started to die out, did the colonial powers start giving their colonies freedom. So it's actually more like capitalism ended colonialism, and they're also confusing cause and effect when they say that capitalism is colonialism, because the truth is just that countries that had better economic systems became richer, and thus they were able to create colonies. So it's blaming the government of those countries' ability to exploit the wealth of their nation on capitalism, which makes no sense. And I'll get a bit more into that later. So the truth is it's actually just richer countries back then were able to be more colonialist. So it's actually very much not the own against capitalism that socialists think it is. So I'm going to put it in pleb zone simply because once you get it, it's really easy to explain to somebody else. This is one of those subjects where the fact that most people don't understand it is more so just an issue with propaganda and not so much an issue with it being difficult to grasp. Next up is empty houses. There's millions of homeless people and millions of empty rooms. Why don't we just give the empty homes to the homeless and we will solve the homeless crisis immediately? Oh my gods, the greed. Yeah, no, this take is another result of far left propaganda. It is total misinformation once you understand it. The problem with this take is that those millions of empty homes aren't really empty. I mean, they kind of are, but the ownership isn't empty. For example, they may be second homes or vacation homes, like cottages or something, and so it might only be empty part of the year. So a common problem might be that a person has a job that requires them to constantly move between two different cities and they own a home in both those cities. I mean, sure, technically when they're not there, how their house is empty, quote unquote empty, but that doesn't mean we should force them to let some random homeless person have their way with their stuff while they're not there. That's kind of silly. And another thing is that a lot of these so-called empty homes are just in financial limbo before they can be sold. So for instance, some houses may be going into some probate or some kind of escrow or foreclosure or whatnot, and then they're put on the market. And so the problem with those homes being empty for so long is more of an issue with legal battles and red tape, which can result in a home being empty for a year or two before it can finally find a new owner. And in that case, it's actually the fault of legal crap and bureaucratic red tape that is preventing people from getting the home. And so some of the reasons that we have empty homes are the result of problems that we could fix. But that doesn't mean you can just give it away during the waiting periods, because people want to buy or use these homes. There's just a time issue in between it. The same logic could be used to say that a homeless person should be able to take over whatever your home is while you're away at work. I mean, just think about how much of a hassle that would be. And the reason why even a child can understand this is that you could explain it the same way to a child. Just tell any kid, hey, should all of your stuff be given away while you're away at school for the day to some other random kid who doesn't want to go to school? And of course they'll say no. So it's a very stupid take. It's based entirely on misinformation on what exactly qualifies as an empty home. This is why I have even a child can understand this also in the same category of you are brainwashed. It is possible for an educated adult to make some of these arguments I'm going to throw down here, are, but only if they are just a completely brainwashed socialist who thinks that private property is bad. If you ask any of those people if they think that their home should be free to use by some random crack junkie while they're out of their house, each and every one of the socialists who try to argue this will immediately show that they don't actually believe it. No serious person actually believes this one. It is just virtue signaling. Next is housing is only expensive because of les greed. So this is similar to the previous argument I just went over, but a little bit more complex. A pleb can definitely fall for this one. And some midwits kind of fall for this one too because they think that the solution to the housing market is other things than building more housing, and they'll come up with a bunch of silly explanations for why that is. So this almost makes it to the midwit category, but it's usually only very far left partisan midwits who will actually defend this. Most educated people understand why this is wrong. The reality is the housing market really is just a supply and demand issue. The reason the housing market is messed up is because of crappy zoning laws and restrictions and regulations which prevent housing from being built. For example, if you just want to build a little shed out in the middle of nowhere, a shed that would ordinarily cost you only maybe $5,000 in terms of material costs, once you get through the red tape and bureaucracy and all the state regulations you have to go through and getting everything approved, that $5,000 shed suddenly costs $40,000. And that is why housing is expensive. A big part of it is that a lot of the rules and regulations on housing just comes from lobbyists that come from the banks. So to some degree, yes, it is greedy bankers, but not in the way that you'd think. What happens is extremely rich corporatists want their housing investments to grow in value, and so they lobby the government for more ridiculous regulations. Things like, oh, you can't build more than a 2-story apartment in this area of town because insert ridiculous reasons here. When of course the real reason is they don't want cheaper housing to be built in their area of town because that would lower the value of their investment properties. So it's more of an issue of government corruption preventing housing from being built, which actually isn't really the same thing as greed. I'll be getting to that one a little later. Or actually, screw it, I'll just do it now. Greed is probably one of the most misunderstood concepts in history, and I'm tempted to put this all the way in economicists, but it's not too hard to grasp when it's explained. So the thing is, greed is actually a good thing. It's violating other people's rights that's a bad thing. Greed, or the desire for more, a desire for better, is actually what incentivizes innovation, which is the biggest factor in leading to more economic growth. If nobody was greedy, we would all still be living in caves, because nobody would have any desires beyond their immediate need. The issue is a lot of people attribute things like cronyism to greed, and while the desire for more plays a part in it, it's more of a problem of the desire for more at somebody else's expense that's the real problem. But if you think about it, it doesn't really make sense to blame that on greed alone, because that's greed plus theft. When it's greed without theft or without the destruction or violation of other people's rights, then greed actually becomes the biggest motivator for creating a better society overall. And so going back to what I said earlier, it's not so much housing is expensive because they greed, but rather it's more like housing is expensive because the government is evil and corrupt. And so they intentionally create ridiculous laws which prevents the market for housing to meet the demand. And so saying that it's because of greed is more of just a misnomer. It's just blaming the wrong thing. And I think most people can understand that once they think about it for a bit. And it's also important to understand that these two together is a common form of propaganda that the government and the media use to try and push authoritarian solutions. They push the idea that it's because of les greed, because that prevents people from understanding the real reason. Because, I mean, let's be honest, if everybody understood the real reason why housing was expensive, then a lot of very corrupt but very powerful people would be losing their jobs. They'd be losing their power very quickly. So the reason people believe these things is more of the result of just a disinformation campaign, but when you think about it, it's really not that hard to understand. Next up is free stuff, or Santaism as we like to sometimes call it. Now, Santaism is more of a question of to what degree people believe in Santaism. Even a child can understand why everything cannot be free, for the same reason that even a child can understand why no infinite money. But then many economicists might say that just basic things should be free, so a basic public state-enforced welfare system. So I think the fair spot to put Santaism is in for the people who believe that it should be more than what it currently is, which is already way too much. And that goes to pleb zone. Santaism can also be in the midwit zone if we're strictly talking about people who are very far left in terms of socialist economic policies. But the thing is, you can explain the welfare trap to the average pleb. You can explain why public welfare disincentivizes people to actually better themselves pretty easily to the average person. But kids probably would have trouble with that one. So we're just going to throw Santaism right there. Next up is just a common misconception that economics is just the study of money, when in reality economics is more of the study of human action and how and why people allocate resources and resolve scarcity in certain ways. It's a lot more complicated than simply studying money. This is actually another one very closely tied to apathy. It's a very common misconception from people who haven't read basic economics books like Economics in One Lesson or something. But then again, once you actually explain that, your average pleb high school graduate can pretty easily understand it. It's more than just money. Most people just have this misconception because they don't care rather than because they aren't able to understand it. Most people can understand this one. In fact, it's almost going into even a child. I'm pretty sure some preteens could get this one, but I'll just drop it in the pleb zone. Next up is Ludditism. Now, in the form of neo-Ludditism, which is people who hate AI, you might be able to put this up in the midwit zone because they do kind of have an understandable but wrong argument that AI will actually completely replace the human. The problem is that's only the case if you have AI under intellectual property rights, which should not exist. As long as AI isn't calling the shots, as long as it's a person behind the will of what's going on, and we don't fall into the incredibly stupid pit trap of giving it intellectual property rights, so that way everyone can use it, it will most likely just change certain jobs rather than taking all the jobs away. More likely, it'll just be used to greatly reduce scarcity even more. And so yes, that may mean that people end up working less if artificial superintelligence beyond human intelligence is what we reach very soon. But that will be because we don't have to work. The only real problem to be concerned with is if governments decide to give AI algorithms IP rights. Then we are completely screwed. But as for regular Ludditism, it has always been stupid. When you look back in history at all the Ludditism that's gone on, it always looks completely ridiculous. Because yes, certain people who had an old way of doing things had to adapt or find a new job, but in the long run, economic growth made it so that everyone was better off, even them eventually. It's very short-sighted thinking. Again, taken to its logical conclusions, we would all be just sitting in caves. For a different reason than lay greed, but if Ludditism was the argument against every single invention that made reducing scarcity easier, then we would still be a primitive species. Even a child can understand this one. You can just explain to a child how their iPad wouldn't exist, and they would get it. Next is the fixed pie fallacy. So this is a funny one because a lot of midwits and plebs and even some economicists believe this one, which is really, really weird because even a child can understand it. Even a kid can understand that the world is not zero-sum. Baking a pie does not mean that somebody else does not have pie. Creating something does not mean somebody else lost out on that creation. Trade happens when both people believe that they are getting a good deal. There is no fixed pie. I understood this one back when I was a kid. It continuously baffles me how there are actual adults who still don't understand this one. It's really weird. From what I've seen, it's usually people who are brainwashed. Adults who believe this usually fall into the midwit category of people who attended places like UC Santa Cruz or something for sociology, and they just kind of mindlessly and unquestioningly believed everything that their Marxist professor crammed inside their heads. Yeah, always fun to remember that these people exist whenever it's time to vote. Every time you have a ballot, remember that there is a person out there who thinks like this, who is completely negating your vote, because you know darn well exactly what they're going to vote for. They're going to vote for more taxes in order to stick it to the man by giving the man more of our money. And it's really sad because you can imagine some pretty obvious scenarios that disprove this, like two farmers trading their crops with each other so that they both get a more balanced diet. It's really, really obvious why trade is not zero-sum. What a world we live in. Anyway, next up is the repair paradox. So this is a little bit more of an interesting one. It's one of the issues that can sometimes stem from strict empiricism, but it's an easy one that everyone can kind of understand is wrong. So let's say someone breaks down your door, and now you have to pay in order to repair that door. Well, at the time that happens, it seems like GDP is going up. And so that kind of brings a paradox. If GDP good, then wouldn't it make sense to just break everybody's door? And the answer, of course, again, when you're someone who understands that in order to understand economics truly, you need to be a rationalist to some degree at least. It's pretty obvious why this doesn't actually make sense, because that would destroy the opportunity cost that people would have to spend their money on something else more productive. If you just push it to its logical conclusions, it's pretty easy for the average pleb to understand why it's wrong. The logical conclusions being, well, why don't we just blow up all the cities? Well, the answer is obvious, because then all the money would be going to repair and there would be no money going to anything else. And so on paper it would look like lots of money is moving, but in reality everyone's building back from the Stone Age. It's another one of those things where if you refuse to be rational about the economy, you end up with the logical conclusion of, once again, everyone's living in caves. Very stupid. Your average pleb can understand this. If you see an educated person saying this, then you are seeing an example of what happens when a not so bright person gets educated. Next up is tariffs. Now, this one, of course, has been a recent product of partisanship. I see a lot of DNC partisans arguing against the Trump tariffs are the same people who defended Biden when he did tariffs and when he did the Inflation Reduction Act, which has very similar negative effects as tariffs. However, I don't put it in the pleb zone because there is a little bit of nuance to tariffs. Most people can understand the logical problem with tariffs, which push to its conclusion, why not just have tariffs at the individual level, and therefore we should extend protectionism to even within our own family. You realize very quickly that it doesn't actually make very much sense to do everything yourself. Having a massive economy where people are specialized leads to more innovation, better goods, and cheaper goods for everybody. However, the issue I see, and the reason I put it in the midwit zone, is because there is a slightly better argument, but is still wrong, that I'm seeing rebirthing coming from the type of people who support Donald Trump no matter what he does, which is the claim that tariffs are short-term loss for long-term gain as it incentivizes more growth within the country. And the problem is that's actually wrong. It doesn't actually incentivize that much growth within the country. Because first of all, because the cost for tariffs almost always gets passed to the consumer, people end up with less money to invest in themselves and their country. But also because tariffs generally disproportionately hit very specific sectors of the economy more so than others. And so what actually happens in tariffs in the long run is a very similar problem to rent control. It benefits very specific people, but screws most people over in the long run. Because the issue with tariffs is really the same issue with a lot of forms of taxation. Again, tariffs, if you don't know, is just another form of tax. It's just a tax that happens through the customs process. And what it really does is it just gives the government more money for them to keep redirecting that money to something that is less productive. It is a bit more complicated, and that's why I put it in the midwit zone instead of the pleb zone, but studies have been pretty extensive on tariffs, and no, they don't have a long-term gain. And to answer the question before anybody asks it, if tariffs aren't good, then why do over 100 other countries tariff America? Because it's the government using that as a form of gaining more money. I mean, the same logic could be extended to every other bad thing that other countries do. If free speech is so good, then why do over 100 other countries not have free speech? If the right to bear arms is so good, then why is it so heavily restricted in other countries besides America? You'll quickly realize that the answer to this is because governments are irrational and corrupt all around the world. Just think of something that most governments do that you don't personally agree with, and you'll quickly understand why this reasoning is flawed. Or a similar retort is just pointing out the fact that those countries who are tariffing America are all poorer than America. So clearly it hasn't really been working out too well for them. Anyway, moving on to post-scarcity. Post-scarcity will never happen because human desires are infinite. It is a nonsensical commie belief that even a child can understand doesn't make any sense. It is a utopian dream that will never happen, and plus it doesn't really change the fact that you would still need rights in that society. Even in a hypothetical utopia land where you can just wish for things and you just have it magically given to you for free, there would still be things like other people's personal space, and so you could still have conflict in that area. People would absolutely find things to bicker over and have scarcity over, and thus you still have to respect property rights. And this idea of post-scarcity communism in the future immediately reveals itself to just not be a thing. The only adults who believe in this are brainwashed. Even a child can understand it for the same reason the child can understand the infinity-free everything version of Santaism. It's just a more pseudo-intellectual way of saying the same thing. Next up is the labor theory of value. I kinda want to put this under even a child can understand it or pleb zone, but there is some pedantic truth to it that in a monopoly, a big mega corporation could just kind of pay their workers nothing. However, that only happens in an unnatural scenario at the backing of the state, and it doesn't really change the fact that value is subjective anyway. And so communists who believe in the labor theory of value, they're usually misattributing their feelings of how they think the economy is unfair in certain regards to a very outdated and very flawed theory that makes very little sense. In reality, the labor theory of value doesn't work because then people would have no incentive to create businesses in the first place. Hans Hermann Hoppe probably continues to have the best debunk of this. The problem with the labor theory of value is that it doesn't take time preferences into account. When a worker trades their labor, they're also trading in the amount of time it would take them to create their own business. And so that difference in incentive and time is where the profit actually comes from. It's not coming from stealing their labor value. The reality is labor is also subject to subjective value. It is worth whatever it can sell for on the market. I'm kind of tempted to put this lower. I'm tempted to put it to even a child can understand it, or maybe the pleb zone, because even a relatively uneducated adult can still understand why it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to think that stocking store shelves for 5 minutes means that you should then own part of the company. But there's enough midwits who argue incessantly about this one that I'll put it in the midwit zone. Next is Snobbism. So this is our first one that goes to economicists. Snobbism is the belief that only economists should have opinions on economics. And it's stupid because anybody can study and understand human action, but also because rational understanding of the economy requires reasoning ability above all else. And because of that, if you have a choice between believing someone who has a master's degree in math and an IQ that is plus 3 SD to have an opinion on economics versus, say, an economist, well, let's just say that that economist is plus 0 SD, I would actually put more money on the first guy to understand economics better than the economist. Especially an economist using the Snobbist argument. Pretty much any economist who makes the Snobbism argument is probably an economicist. They probably do not have an understanding to match their level of study. And so it's entirely reasonable to view Snobbism as a form of economicist midwit cope. I have never seen an intelligent economist say this. It's always some hack with no relevant contributions to the field. Next up is inflation stupidity. And there's a lot of bad takes on inflation, but I'm just going to lump them all into here because you understand why all the bad takes on inflation are bad takes when you understand what inflation is, which is more money chasing the same goods. Because money is subject to the laws of supply and demand like everything else. And therefore all takes like Biden's Inflation Reduction Act or blaming inflation on greed, you just kind of automatically rationally understand why that's wrong. However, there is enough misinformation out there and propaganda that even a lot of midwits believe this one, so I'll put inflation stupidity in the midwit zone. Even though a lot of plebs can probably understand why blaming businesses for raising their prices on greed for inflation doesn't really make much sense, the equivocations and arguments behind that are complex enough that plenty of educated adults fall for this one. Next is Keynes worship. Straight to economicists. That one's pretty much self-explanatory. Who cares if it stunts economic growth in the long run? We'll all be dead anyway. Truly an economic genius of our time. Next is forecastism. This is the belief that economists can make accurate judgments of what the economy will do in the future. This is one of those things that economists want you to believe, but it isn't really true. I mean, some models are relatively somewhat accurate, but they're only ever accurate in the short run. To give you an idea, right now, a lot of economists are predicting a recession, but the thing is that prediction really only has about a 40% chance of coming true. And so economists can predict better than a monkey rolling a dice, but the accuracy is very limited. If you ask 10 economists what the stock market will be in 10 years from now, they should all hopefully tell you that it will be higher, because the stock market over time always is somewhat higher, but none of them will be able to accurately tell you what will be what. They will not be able to give you specific numbers. And the reason is because human action is subjective, and therefore any mathematical model that tries to plot economics or resolve economics is doomed to eventually be wrong. There's just too many qualitative factors to be able to successfully create an accurate forecast with just quantitative factors. The very few models that do tend to be relatively accurate within 80% or better, they only do so because they're based on very obvious human psychology that anybody could predict. Like percentage chance for hungry people to buy food. Gee, I wonder if people will buy food. Real tough one. Gonna have to put our thinking caps on for that one. Next is the farmer. And what I mean by this is a common misunderstanding between net worth and income. People not really getting that they're not the same thing. I also sometimes call this one the rich farmer fallacy. And it's based on the belief that farmers are very rich and that we should tax their inheritance. And the problem with this is that yes, farmers have very high net worth due to the vast amounts of land that they own, but all of those assets only generate a very small amount of income. And that's why farmers are often at risks of going bankrupt. Because sure, they have a lot, but it's not an easy job. And some people might be tempted to put this one in the midwit category, but it's actually very easy to understand. Usually the farmer fallacy argument is coming from politicians who know that they're lying. They just want to come up with an excuse to tax people more. And yes, it is communist garbage. Taking 20% of a business away every generation when that business doesn't actually generate that much income, that is absolutely a track road to ownership of everything by a centralized communist dictatorship. The people who advocate for things like this are the same people who think that billionaires just have $1 billion sitting in a bank account somewhere. They just empirically look at net worth and they don't try to understand anything else. Very stupid. Next is a common misconception that GDP equals growth. I'm gonna throw this in the midwit zone because it's one of those things that's pedantically correct sometimes. GDP is a relatively good guess of economic growth. But as I explained earlier, not all economic activity is created equal. What economic growth actually is an economy's better ability to meet people's desires. So it's innovation and ingenuity that usually drives economic growth. It just so happens that that's usually correlated with higher GDP, because people will trade more in an economy that has high economic growth. But it's not actually GDP itself. Common misconception, midwit zone. Which I guess next I'll go to infinite growth. This is one of those things that even a child can get. No, you don't need infinite growth. This is actually kind of a communist propaganda against the free market, saying that capitalism needs infinite growth or else it will collapse. No, growth is desirable, but you don't absolutely need it. You can stagnate for a while without the economy collapsing. You can explain this one to a child pretty easily. Hey, what if you stopped getting presents for your birthday? While that would suck, it doesn't mean that you die. That's not going to kill you. An economy doesn't need to infinitely grow, it just wants to. Next is natural monopolies. Honestly, this one is one of those things that can deserve its own video. There's a lot of things that need to be understood in order to understand why natural monopolies aren't really a thing, and that's why it goes to economicist tier. The TLDR easiest way to understand it is realizing that natural monopolies have never actually existed. Not even in the Gilded Age, not even with oil barons. But there's a lot of nuance behind it, so I would just recommend reading Thomas D. Lorenzo in his review of Austrian economics, because there's a lot of information packed behind that one. Anyway, next is positive freedom. This is the belief that society should focus more on positive freedom, or the freedom to have things to do whatever you want, more so than negative freedom, which is the freedom to do things without external constraints or interference from other people. And the reality is, even a child can understand why this was wrong when you realize that it's just putting the cart before the horse. All positive freedom really is just the freedom to enjoy the benefits of wealth. But you need negative freedom in order to create wealth, and thus negative freedom creates positive freedom. It's just another pseudo-intellectual argument for communism. But the reality is, even a child can understand why it doesn't make sense. It's like saying you can have your cake and eat it too. A child can understand why eating their cake means that they no longer have their cake. A child can understand that in order for them to be able to eat the cake needed to be created. There is no magic infinity cake. It's just another way of arguing for the post-scarcity crap. Big dumb. Next up is capitalism is when bribery. This is a very common midwit take. The government is corrupt and the solution is more government. You realize that it's wrong when you learn that most of what lobbyists lobby for is just more regulation, not less regulation. There's a very big common authoritarian disinformation campaign to try and claim the opposite is true. There's just enough nuance behind it though to put it into the midwit zone. But I already did a whole video on why this one is wrong. Next is believing in decentralized communism, or people who don't understand why a communist society would need a centralized authority. And this is another big propaganda one that is only believed by people who are brainwashed, but this one is at least a bit more complex. I don't think you could fully explain this one to a child because you need a good understanding of history to understand why it's wrong. And commies spread enough disinformation about that history, or claim that it is CIA propaganda, but the reality is it goes to the pleb zone instead of the midwit zone because it's actually pretty easy to understand why it's wrong rationally. You can't have things be collectively owned without pooling the resources somewhere. And because there is no collective mind, somebody has to call the shots on those resources. And it can't be voluntary because if it was, then well, that's a mutual aid society, and that's actually a form of anarcho-capitalism. And lastly, I've saved this fun propaganda for the final blow, the idea that taxes cure deficits. This is a particularly favored talking point from authoritarian, corrupt politicians. You will see them make this complaint whenever someone wants to lower taxes. They'll complain that, oh, lowering the taxes would add to the national debt. This one's going to go to the midwit zone because it's pretty easy for it to seem intuitively correct. I mean, if the government takes in more money, then it can pay off the debts. Seems pretty simple, but it's actually wrong. And there's a lot of things that you need to understand to fully understand why this is wrong, but a simple example of how it would be wrong is to ask yourself, which is more, 10% of $100,000 or 1% of $1 billion? Yeah. You see, the problem is taxation really just redirects funds to the non-productive sectors of the economy. And so the only real way to get rid of the debt is to stop allowing the government to add to the debt, as lowering taxes leads to more productivity. And thus tax increases cannot be a viable cure for deficits. More taxes just encourages the government to waste more money. It's like lending money to a drug addict in hopes that the drug addict will use that money to pay off the debt. They're not going to do it. They're just going to buy more drugs. Same with the government. When you give them more of your money, they just spend it on stupid stuff. And then vote to raise the debt ceiling. It's one of those things that only looks like a cure if you only look at it on paper and you don't think about it logically. You cannot just keep giving resources to an irresponsible party in hopes that that will just somehow make them responsible. And thus the only real cure to the deficit is to instead cut the federal budget. Lending money to the crack addict will not make the crack addict pay his rent. He will go out and buy more crack. That is how it actually works in practice. And what's disturbing about this one is that economists mostly know this. The majority of economists understand, at the very least, even if they're an authoritarian-ish economist, it's a pretty well-known, well-accepted consensus that government spending is more wasteful than the private sector. And so this is just propaganda from politicians. When you see a politician complaining about tax cuts because deficits, they are lying to you. They are trying to gaslight you into thinking that they're totally going to spend more responsibly if you just give them more of your money. Just like that one addict relative of yours that's asking you to borrow more money knows that he's just going to go out and buy more crack. He's not actually going to use the money you let him borrow to get his life on track or whatever. He knows he's lying. He knows he's going to go buy more drugs. Just like corrupt politicians know that they're just going to vote for more pork spending. They're not actually going to do anything about the deficit. And yet midwits still believe them anyway. Are politicians Politicians are liars, and the solution is to continue believing everything they say. Kinda sad, really. But anyway, that is all. Here is the full tier list. There's a lot of other simple, bad economic takes out there, but these are the ones that I tend to see the most. Especially the no infinite money one. That one always cracks me up. At least until I remember that those people, unfortunately, have the right to vote. But anyways, that is all. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and share and all that stuff. And if you want to support my content, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch, which again, there is a new relevant meme shirt on the merch store for this video. That is on an introductory sale price. And I'll also be keeping the Left Can't meme merch on sale for a little while longer too. In fact, considering it, I think I'll just keep that one up for the month of April, just to go in line with April 1st. But yeah, that is all. Again, thanks for watching. Till next time.